Hey there. We are going to take a look at taking a regular photo that you took with your smartphone or point and shoot camera and make it a little bit more interesting. This is a photo that I found on IKEAhacker.blogspot.com, and when I posted about this project yesterday, which is a IKEA do-it-yourself iPad stand, I thought it was a really neat project, but the photo could look a bit better. For example, the crop isn't all that great. You've got, all this extra stuff, and the iPad and the stand is not really featured too well in the photo because it's down a little bit more. Plus, the color is not great. Plus, you've got a really deep depth of field here. So we're not really getting direct focus on whether or not we should focus on the iPad or the couch or this coffee cup over here. So I thought, okay, well, let's see what we can do, and I turned it from this into this. Now, we're going to take a look on how to do those things in Photoshop, or really any image editor you have that has a selection tool and a gradient tool and a Gaussian blur filter. So first, let's isolate the iPad from the background. We're going to use the polygonal lasso tool, which you can find underneath the lasso tool in Photoshop if you've never used it before. Now, there are a lot of ways to select stuff in Photoshop. This is just the way I prefer. You can do it however you like. And it's really easy because you can just go edge to edge here and select what you need. There we go. Just grabbing all along the edge of the tables. And so I'm going to be a little lazy on this coffee cup here because there's not really a whole lot of edge detail. So when it gets blurred, you're not going to be able to tell that I didn't really select it properly. So here we are. Oops. There's the selection of the background, basically. And I'm going to copy the background and then paste it right in there. So now you can't really tell that anything changed, but there's actually just this background layer there now that we've selected that. And I'm going to go to Filter and Blur and choose Gaussian Blur. And as you see, I can kind of control the blurriness of the background. Now that's a little insane there. We don't need that much, but like 2 is probably a good number for a photo like this. And so now we've got an out of focus background. Now naturally the table is going to be a little out of focus too if we have that much of a blur, so I'm going to go back to the background and select just some edges of the table here. And you don't have to be perfect because the previous blur is going to cover up what we're selecting here, so you don't have to worry about selecting the edges of the table so much. And so I'm just going to get the parts that would be out of focus a little bit and then copy and paste those too. And as you can see, we have that selection isolated. And I'm going to use Gaussian blur again, but this time I'm not going to do it as much because if it's the same, then it's just like, okay, well, there's no transition there, which is unnatural. So I'm going to give this a little bit less than normal, and you can see it's starting to transition into the blur this way. Now, if you feel like the transition isn't as smooth as you'd like, you can just take the eraser tool and blend it in a little bit. Now, we've isolated, so that's great. And I'm going to go ahead and just merge all these layers together because we don't need them as a separate layer anymore. And just clean things up a little bit. Now, the next thing we want to do is basically put a little bit of a spotlight on this. And the easy way to do that is to go to the gradient tool, which is shared with the paint bucket tool, and choose just a white to black gradient. Now what you want to do is start from the middle and go out. Make sure that you're set to radial, by the way, so you get a spotlight right there. And then you're going to want to do that on its own layer though, otherwise it's going to cover up the picture like I just did. And let's do that one more time. Middle, out. There we go. And then set it to multiply. And so what that's going to do is add darkened areas around the edge of the photo and create a spotlight. Now, you don't want everything to be really dark, and having a spotlight like this can cause that sort of a problem, so you're really focusing a little too narrowly. So if that is a problem for you, use the eraser tool and then set your brush size to quite large so you can fill up most of it and just start erasing to brighten things up a little bit. Now I think that was maybe a little too much because what we're also going to do is reduce the opacity. So you just get a little bit of a darkened corner there. And now we've got that. Lastly, we're going to do pretty much the same thing to add some color. I'm going to make a new layer, and I'm going to go to the gradient tool, and I'm going to choose a color filter. Now, sometimes you can just use a single solid color, which works fine too. I like this blue, yellow, and pink gradient, so I'm going to use that. You can experiment with things that you want. I'm going to start right from the middle and go out again and create that gradient. And then I'm going to go down to the layers panel and choose the blending mode color. And that's going to add a nice kind of gasoline-y looking color to the photo. But we don't want it to be that prominent because that's really excessive. So I'm going to dial this down all the way. The opacity is now at 0. So we're back where we started. And just start to bring it up a little bit so we can start getting that nice color effect. And you see the iPod screen's turning a little bit more blue because blue is the center color of the gradient. And the others are being affected by the yellow and pinkish red color as well. And so you do this until you get kind of the color look you want, and I would say that's pretty good. Now the last thing I want to do, I'm going to merge everything together first, but the last thing I want to do is get rid of some of this crap here. Now if you're using Photoshop CS5, you can basically select anything in the background layer like this and hit delete, and the content aware filter will do a decent job of replacing it. That's not perfect. Alternatively, you can go through with the healing brush or clone stamp. I'm going to use the clone stamp in this case. Go through and just clone out anything that you don't want. So I'm going to make this big enough and make sure the brush is set to not very hard edges. And then just go through and paint it out. But we don't want to do it like that because that looks bad. So here we go. Now what ends up happening when you use the clone stamp is that it looks a little bit bright because I'm pulling from a brighter area. So in this case, sometimes the healing brush will be better. I'm going to use that to bring it out because the healing brush will make up for those mistakes. Now I obviously got a little bit of the ticket right there. Get rid of any errors. Sometimes it's a little hit or miss with the healing brush, but it's an easy way to just bring things out. And then I'm going to go ahead and crop this photo to 640 by 480, which is the size that I want. 640, 480. And there we go. Now, naturally, what we would want to do here is, instead of having this on the background layer, because now if I move it around, can't, is to make a copy of the layer. We'll just duplicate it, and then do that same conversion to 640 by 480. And now we can move this around as we like in the photo. And we've got something a bit nicer than what we started with.